It was just another Monday morning, or so I thought. I walked into the office with my usual cup of coffee, ready to tackle the day like any other. But that day something was different. Something shifted, and I didn't even see it coming. I had always been a hard worker, never asking for recognition, just doing my job. I was the kind of person who showed up early, stayed late, and quietly made sure everything was running smoothly. My boss, though? He didn't appreciate that. In fact, he barely noticed. But that day, in front of the entire team, everything changed. The moment he opened his mouth, I knew my world was about to be turned upside down. "Can anyone tell me why this report is missing the financial projections?" he snapped, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Everyone looked around nervously, waiting for someone else to answer. And then, just like that, his gaze landed on me. I froze. I knew I'd double-checked everything the night before. The numbers were all there, everything was correct. But before I could speak, before I could explain, he cut me off with a harsh, "You're the one in charge of this, aren't you?" The room fell silent. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I didn't let it show. I was a professional, but that didn't stop the wave of embarrassment that washed over me. "Well, it's clearly not here," he continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "Did you even bother to check your work? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" The words stung like a slap. My face burned, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I wanted to shout, to explain that I'd spent hours on this, to show him the numbers, the projections, everything that proved I wasn't wrong. But I couldn't speak. It was like something was blocking my throat, trapping my words inside. And just like that, he moved on, ignoring me completely, as if I wasn't even standing there, as if I hadn't just been humiliated in front of the entire team. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, frozen in that moment of humiliation, unable to defend myself or even get a word in. My colleagues avoided eye contact, their faces awkwardly turned away, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a public shaming. The rest of the meeting dragged on, but I couldn't focus. All I could hear was the echo of his voice in my head. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him everything I'd done, how hard I'd worked, how I'd gone above and beyond to make sure everything was perfect. But he didn't care. To him, I was just another tool to be used and discarded when it suited him. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I had been living in his shadow for too long. I had let his words, his power, define me. But that day, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let him get away with this anymore. This wasn't just about a missing report. It was about a pattern. A pattern of control. A pattern of using people. A pattern of manipulation that had been happening for months, maybe even years. And as I sat there, humiliated and defeated, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to stay in this position forever. This humiliation was the push I needed to make a change. But I wasn't going to do it by quitting. No, I had a plan. It was time for him to fall. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the meeting over and over in my head. I kept questioning why it had happened, and if there was anything I could have done to stop it. Was it personal? Did I deserve to be humiliated like that in front of everyone? No matter how much I turned the situation over in my mind, one thing became clear: it wasn't a one-off mistake. It wasn't just about the missing report or a bad day at work. It was a pattern, one I had ignored for far too long. My boss had been belittling me and undermining my work repeatedly, all while making himself look untouchable. That realization was as bitter as it was undeniable. In the quiet of my apartment, my frustration began to shift. Anger replaced the sting of embarrassment, but not the kind of anger that left me helpless. This was a fire burning in me, one that fueled the idea that I had to do something about it. I wasn't just angry at him anymore. I was frustrated with myself for allowing it to continue for so long. I had let him dictate my worth and my place in the team, but not anymore. As I sat there thinking, I realized I had been looking at the situation all wrong. It wasn't about proving my worth to him. It was about proving my worth to myself and showing the team that I wasn't just another face in the office. Over the next few days, I began to notice things I hadn't seen before. His mistakes weren't isolated incidents, they were everywhere. Missed deadlines, disorganized meetings, forgotten emails. It was subtle at first, but it was all there, building up quietly in the background. I started stepping in when he faltered, fixing his oversights without drawing attention to myself. When a deal was on the verge of collapse because he hadn't followed up, I sent the necessary emails to keep things on track. When a project deadline was at risk, I stayed late to ensure everything was completed. My focus wasn't on getting credit for the work. It was about showing that I could handle it, even when he couldn't. I started to see a shift in how people treated me. Colleagues began asking for my input more often, and I noticed the subtle looks from upper management during meetings. It was as if they were starting to see what I was capable of, even if they didn't say it outright. I knew the tide was beginning to turn, but I also knew I had to play this carefully. I couldn't act impulsively or rush into anything. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about strategy. Every move I made had to be deliberate. At home I spent hours preparing. I studied leadership, analyzed my boss's decisions, and learned everything I could about his role. I made it my mission to know his responsibilities inside and out, anticipating every challenge that might come my way. It wasn't enough to simply fix his mistakes. I needed to be ready to step into his position and do the job better than he ever had. The more I prepared, the clearer it became that I could succeed where he had failed. I wasn't just working hard to prove a point, I was building something, piece by piece. Each passing day strengthened my resolve. I wasn't ready to make my move just yet, but I could feel the moment getting closer. I was patient, deliberate, and focused. For now, I stayed in the background, quietly observing, knowing that when the opportunity came, I would be ready to take it. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet kind of anticipation. I had set the wheels in motion, but I wasn't about to make any rash moves just yet. I knew the timing had to be perfect, and I had to be ready to strike when it mattered most. Patience was key. I was no longer the employee who kept her head down and followed orders. I was now the one watching, analyzing, and waiting for the right opportunity to present itself. Then, it came. One afternoon, my boss made a critical mistake. He'd been handling a major client deal for months, and everyone knew how much was riding on it. He had promised them a comprehensive proposal by the end of the week, but he failed to deliver, citing personal issues and, honestly, just a lack of focus. The deal was on the brink of falling apart, and everyone in the office could sense it. That was when I knew it was time. I walked into his office under the guise of asking for a few updates on other projects. He was sitting behind his desk, buried in papers, distracted, as usual. He barely looked up when I entered. "Hey, how's the proposal coming along?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was racing with excitement. His response was a half-hearted shrug. "It's fine, I'll get it done. It's just been a lot lately." I could see the frustration in his eyes. I knew that he knew how important this was, and I also knew that he was completely overwhelmed. This was his moment of weakness, and I couldn't let it slip by. "I can help," I said, the words coming out before I could even think about them. I wasn't asking. I was offering. He looked at me then, actually making eye contact for the first time in weeks. "What? You think you can help with this? It's a big proposal. You don't know the client like I do." "I know," I replied, my voice steady, "but I've been following the deal closely. I've seen the notes, the emails. I can take some of the work off your plate. We can get this done faster if I jump in." For a second, I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew he was sinking, and I was offering him a lifeline, but it was also a lifeline that would shine a spotlight on my ability to handle his responsibilities. He finally nodded. "Fine. Take the lead on the client proposal. We don't have much time." The moment he agreed, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. It wasn't just about the proposal, it was about proving that I could handle everything he couldn't. It was my chance to show the higher-ups that I was more than capable of doing the job. "I know," I replied, my voice steady, "but I've been following the deal closely. I've seen the notes, the emails. I can take some of the work off your plate. We can get this done faster if I jump in." For a second, I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He knew he was sinking, and I was offering him a lifeline, but it was also a lifeline that would shine a spotlight on my ability to handle his responsibilities. He finally nodded. "Fine. Take the lead on the client proposal. We don't have much time." The moment he agreed, I felt a strange sense of empowerment. It wasn't just about the proposal, it was about proving that I could handle everything he couldn't. It was my chance to show the higher-ups that I was more than capable of doing the job. I wasted no time. I began drafting the proposal immediately, diving into the details, checking everything against the client's needs. I reached out to team members for their input and even coordinated with the marketing department to ensure our messaging was on point. The pressure was immense, but for the first time in a long time it felt like a challenge I was actually ready for. The next morning, I sent him the draft. It was thorough, well-researched, and professional. When I walked into his office to review it, he barely glanced at it. He seemed distracted, already on to something else. But I didn't mind. I wasn't doing this for his approval. I was doing it to take control of the situation. "Looks good," he mumbled, barely looking up. "I'll send it over to the client. Thanks." In that moment, I realized how far removed he had become from his own work. He couldn't even be bothered to review something that could make or break the company. But I was different. I cared about the details. I cared about the work, the results, the outcome. That day, I followed up with the client directly. I ensured the proposal was sent with all the necessary revisions and a personalized cover letter. I knew my boss wouldn't do it, and I wasn't going to let this slip through the cracks. When the client responded the next morning, they were impressed. The deal was moving forward. As I read the email, a wave of satisfaction washed over me. It wasn't just about the success of the deal. It was about the quiet validation of everything I had been preparing for. I wasn't just a capable employee anymore. I was someone who could make things happen. And I was ready to take this to the next level. The success of the proposal was a turning point, but it was just the beginning. I didn't expect the praise to come right away, but I knew my efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. A few days after the proposal was sent, I overheard a conversation in the break room. Two of the senior managers were discussing the deal and how well it had been handled. "That was a really solid proposal," one of them said. "Did you see the follow-up email from protagonist's name? They really took charge." I couldn't help but smile to myself. I wasn't just a background player anymore, I was becoming someone people relied on. Slowly but surely, I was building a reputation for being competent, reliable, and capable. Everything I had done so far had been deliberate, and now it was paying off. It didn't take long for other opportunities to present themselves. Over the next few weeks, I found myself stepping into more responsibilities that were previously handled by my boss. He was too caught up in his own distractions to notice, but I was carefully positioning myself to take on more leadership roles. Every time he dropped the ball on a task, I picked it up quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. And with each success, my confidence grew. I began to get invitations to meetings that I had never been included in before. Higher-ups started to ask for my input, even offering me projects that my boss had once taken the lead on. There were subtle shifts, nothing overt, but enough to make me realize I was starting to gain the trust of the decision-makers in the company. One afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting with the executive team when I saw my boss slink in late. He apologized half-heartedly, but it was clear that his disorganization was beginning to have an impact on his credibility. As the meeting went on, it became obvious that he was out of his depth. The discussions grew more technical, and he started fumbling with his notes, trying to catch up. He kept asking me to clarify points, to explain things that I had already made clear earlier. It was painful to watch, but it was also illuminating. I seized the opportunity to step in. When the conversation shifted to a new project, I jumped in with a well-researched idea that everyone seemed to resonate with. The room went quiet for a moment, and I saw the subtle nods from the executives. I didn't just offer an idea, I owned it. I spoke with authority, answering questions confidently, showing that I had a deeper understanding of the project than anyone in the room, including my boss. When the meeting ended, I could see the change in how people looked at me. It wasn't just respect, it was recognition. The higher-ups had taken notice, and now they knew exactly what I was capable of. They didn't need to ask for my ideas anymore. They were starting to come to me for them. The shift didn't go unnoticed by my boss either. At first, he didn't say anything, but I could see the frustration building in his eyes. He was used to being the one people relied on, the one who called the shots. Now, he was finding himself increasingly irrelevant. I could see the cracks in his confidence, even as he tried to cover them up with deflections and excuses. One day, he called me into his office. I walked in, expecting a routine discussion about an upcoming task. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, he sat back in his chair, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "Listen," he said, leaning forward. "You've been doing a lot lately. A lot. You've been taking on a lot of projects, handling things I should have been on top of. What's your angle here?" I stayed calm, even though my heart was pounding. This was the moment. I could have played it safe, brushed it off, and stayed in my place. But I knew I had to take control. I had to show him that I was no longer his subordinate. "I'm just doing my job," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "I've been putting in the work, and the results speak for themselves." His eyes narrowed, and I could feel the tension between us. "I didn't ask for your help," he muttered, his tone defensive. I didn't flinch. "Maybe you didn't, but I'm here to make sure things don't fall apart. You're clearly overwhelmed, and I'm just stepping up to keep everything on track." He scowled, clearly irritated, but I could see the seeds of doubt planting themselves in his mind. He was starting to wonder if he was losing control, and that was exactly what I wanted. The following weeks were a blur of small victories. Every time he made a misstep, I was there, taking the reins, leading the charge. Slowly, the team began to turn to me more than him. The whispers started, people were talking. They were starting to recognize who had the real leadership potential, and while he tried to maintain his authority, his actions spoke louder than words. He was unraveling, bit by bit. One afternoon, as I walked into the break room, I overheard another conversation that made everything click into place. One of the senior managers was talking to a colleague. "You know, Protagonist's name has been doing such a great job lately. I think they're ready for something bigger, don't you?" The colleague nodded. "Definitely. I've seen the way they handle themselves in meetings. If anyone's ready to take over, it's them." I walked out of the break room, trying to keep my composure, but inside, I was elated. I had earned their respect, their trust, and most importantly, I had earned the opportunity. The momentum I had been building didn't slow down. In fact, it was gaining speed, and with each passing day, I could feel the gap between my boss and me widening. The more he faltered, the more I stepped in to fill the void. At first, it was small things: answering calls he didn't return, handling client complaints he ignored, taking over projects he didn't have the energy for. But soon it became clear. I wasn't just doing his job, I was doing it better. One afternoon, I was sitting in a meeting with a group of senior managers. We were discussing the next phase of a company-wide project, and the atmosphere was tense. My boss had been handling the project up until that point, but it had stalled, the deadlines were slipping, and the team was starting to lose faith in his leadership. As the meeting dragged on, I could sense that the room was growing frustrated. I waited for the right moment, then spoke up. My suggestion was clear and precise, addressing the concerns that had been building up during the discussion. I proposed a new direction, one that would move the project forward and get things back on track. The room was silent for a moment, and then one of the senior managers looked at me, nodding thoughtfully. "That's an interesting approach," he said. "What do you think? Boss's name?" My boss, who had been increasingly distant during the meeting, barely looked up from his notes. "I guess that could work," he muttered, not even offering a detailed response. That was all the opening I needed. I continued to present my idea, outlining how we could implement the changes I had suggested. The team responded positively, and the project was back on track within hours. By the end of the day, I had taken charge of the project, and it felt like the natural progression. I wasn't just helping anymore. I was leading. It didn't take long for my boss to start realizing what was happening. He could see that people were starting to turn to me for guidance. He knew his days were numbered, and the tension between us was becoming palpable. His behavior became more erratic. One morning, he called me into his office for another one of his increasingly rare meetings. When I sat down, he seemed even more agitated than usual. "You think you can just take over everything?" he snapped, his voice rising. "This is still my responsibility." I didn't flinch. I had been waiting for this moment. He was panicking now, and I knew it. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," I replied calmly. "If you're too overwhelmed, I'll step in. The team can't afford to wait for you to catch up." His face reddened, and for a moment, I thought he might snap. But instead, he just glared at me, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You're overstepping," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm doing what's best for the company," I responded, keeping my tone even. "If that means stepping in when things are falling apart, then that's what I'll do." He didn't say anything more, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He knew I was no longer just a part of the team, I was becoming the leader the company needed, even if it meant pushing him out of the way. Around this time, I also began to form deeper alliances with key figures in the company. One of the senior managers who had been quietly observing me reached out. We had never been particularly close, but now she seemed to want to take me under her wing. She invited me to lunch and, as we talked, I realized that she was positioning me to take over the boss's role in a more formal way. "You're handling things better than he ever did," she said, almost as if testing the waters. "You're the kind of leader this company needs." Her words felt like a confirmation of everything I had been working towards. It wasn't just about getting by anymore, it was about leading. We talked about the future, about how things could change if the right person was in charge. It was subtle, but I could see that the executives were starting to view me as a leader in my own right. The pieces were falling into place. Over the next few weeks, I took on more and more of my boss's responsibilities. I became the go-to person for high-stakes projects, taking the reins on initiatives that would have otherwise been his. Slowly but surely, people began to realize that I was capable of running things. I had become indispensable, and the thought of the company moving forward without me was starting to feel unthinkable. And then, just when I thought I had everything in place, my boss made the final, irreversible mistake. It was a crucial meeting with a potential investor, one that could determine the future of the company. He had been preparing for this meeting for weeks, and it was clear that the pressure had gotten to him. When the day came, he was unprepared. He stammered through the presentation, missing key points, fumbling with the slides, and making critical errors. I watched from the back of the room, my heart pounding. I had been ready for this moment. The investor looked unimpressed, and the room grew tense. My boss was sinking fast, and I knew if I didn't step in, the deal would fall apart. Without a second thought, I stood up and walked to the front of the room. "Let me take it from here," I said, cutting through the tension like a knife. My boss looked at me, his face pale, but he didn't object. He knew he had lost control. I picked up where he left off, smoothing over his mistakes and refocusing the presentation. I answered questions with ease, presenting the company in the best light possible. The investor's tone shifted, and within minutes, the mood in the room went from cold to optimistic. By the end of the meeting, the deal was secured. As we all filed out of the room, I could see my boss standing in the corner, defeated. He had nothing to say to me. He knew the game was over. The company's atmosphere was growing more charged by the day. My boss, despite his best efforts to maintain some sense of authority, was unraveling. His mistakes were too numerous, his decisions too erratic. I had already taken over key projects, and people had started to look at me, not just as a competent team member, but as a leader. Every time he faltered, I stepped in. Every time he hesitated, I took the lead. And now, I could feel that something big was about to happen. It was clear to everyone but him that his time was running out. His decisions were becoming more questionable, and people had started whispering about his performance. The executives who had once been in his corner were now starting to look to me for answers. It was only a matter of time before the inevitable confrontation took place. And then, it happened. It was a Tuesday morning when I received an email with a meeting invite. It was from the CEO at the top of the company chain. I had never been called into a meeting like this before, and I knew something was up. I was going to meet with the CEO, alongside my boss, to discuss the future direction of the company. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I had a feeling this meeting would change everything. As I walked into the CEO's office that afternoon, I found my boss already sitting at the table, looking unusually tense. The CEO was seated at the head of the table, and the mood was heavy with expectation. There was a noticeable shift in the air. "We need to talk about the direction of the company," the CEO began, glancing between me and my boss. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that I couldn't ignore. "There have been some concerns about our current projects and leadership." My heart skipped a beat, but I didn't show it. I had prepared myself for this moment. I had known it was coming, and now, it was here. My boss, as usual, tried to take control of the conversation. "Everything is fine, we're just going through some growing pains. The market's tough, but we'll get through it," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. But the CEO wasn't buying it. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on my boss. "It's not just about the market, it's about your leadership. We've seen a decline in productivity and performance over the last few months. Your approach isn't working, and we're not seeing results." I could see my boss tense up, his face reddening. This was the moment he had been dreading. For all his bluster, he had nothing to say in defense. He was caught. "Let's be honest," the CEO continued, his tone unwavering. "We've been looking at a number of options, and we're considering restructuring some key positions. Protagonist's name has been leading the team effectively, and their work speaks for itself." I could feel the weight of the CEO's words. It was happening. It wasn't just about recognition anymore, it was about power. The team had seen my potential, and the higher-ups were finally acknowledging it. But it was more than that. This was the moment I had been working toward for months. My boss opened his mouth to protest, but the CEO raised his hand, signaling for him to stop. I don't think there's anything more to discuss, he said firmly. We've made our decision. I watched as my boss, the man who had once humiliated me, slumped back in his chair, his face twisted in disbelief. This was it. This was the moment he realized that his time had passed. The CEO looked at me and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. Effective immediately. We're promoting you to take over as head of the department. You've earned it. As I left the CEO's office, I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I had done it. I had taken control. But there was still one thing left to do: face my former boss. I found him in his office, pacing back and forth, clearly agitated. When I walked in, his eyes flashed with anger. So, this is it then? He sneered. You've taken my job. Happy now? I didn't react to his bitterness. I knew better than to get drawn into a petty argument. You didn't take care of business, I said calmly. I did. I stepped up when you couldn't. This is the result. He scowled, his jaw clenched, but there was nothing left for him to say. His empire had crumbled around him, and now, it was my turn to take charge. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? He spat, his voice dripping with resentment. I built this department. You think they'll respect you? They already do, I replied, my voice steady. You built this department, but I'm the one who's going to make it thrive. I turned and walked out of his office without looking back. There was no need for further confrontation. The decision had been made. The company had spoken. As I sat in my new office, the weight of the promotion finally hit me. I had done it. The seat that had once been my boss's was now mine. I didn't feel a sense of triumph, though. It wasn't about revenge, it was about something far more important: respect. For so long I had been underestimated, humiliated, and dismissed. But now, I had proven that I was capable of far more than anyone had ever given me credit for. I had turned his mistakes into my victory. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out the one thing I had kept all these months: the business card my boss had once given me. I had kept it as a reminder of how far I had come, from the quiet employee in the back of the room to the leader at the head of the table. This was just the beginning. I had learned what I needed to learn, fought the battles I needed to fight, and now, I was in control. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready. The company was mine now, and I was going to take it further than it had ever gone before. And the best part? I had done it all on my own terms. Taking over my boss's position wasn't just about the title. It wasn't about the prestige or the power that came with it. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above, that I could turn adversity into opportunity and use my own struggles as stepping stones to get ahead. But as the days went by, I quickly realized that with leadership came an entirely new set of challenges that I hadn't fully prepared for, despite everything I'd done to get here. The first few weeks were a whirlwind. I moved into my new office, which was bigger and better than anything I'd had before. The staff started to look at me differently too. They respected me more now that I was in charge, but they also had expectations. The weight of their gaze, the quiet nods of approval, it was all part of a new reality I wasn't used to. Suddenly, I wasn't just one of the team anymore. I was the one they turned to when things went wrong. At first, it felt like a relief. I had finally earned the respect that had been so long in coming. But as the responsibilities mounted, I began to feel the pressure. It wasn't enough to just maintain the status quo. I had to do better than what had been done before. The department needed a leader who could take them beyond the stagnation they'd been stuck in for years. They needed someone who could inspire them, challenge them, and help them see new possibilities. It didn't take long for the cracks in the department's foundation to show. The culture of complacency that my boss had fostered for so long had left a mark on the team. People were used to operating in the shadows, hiding behind vague directives and unclear expectations. They were comfortable in their mediocrity. I couldn't let that continue. I had learned the hard way that success didn't come from doing things the way they had always been done. It came from challenging norms, pushing boundaries, and most importantly, holding people accountable. One of the first changes I made was instituting clear goals and deadlines. There was no more room for ambiguity. Everyone knew what was expected of them, and if they didn't deliver, they would face the consequences. It wasn't easy at first. People resisted. Some employees tried to test me, pushing back against the new structure I was putting in place. But I didn't budge. I had worked too hard to get here. I knew what needed to be done, and I was willing to make the tough decisions. Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. People started to understand that I wasn't there to play favorites or make things easier. I was there to make the department thrive. In the weeks that followed, I began to implement small, but important, changes. I focused on building a stronger team not just by holding individuals accountable, but by bringing people together to collaborate and innovate. I encouraged transparency and open communication, something that had been sorely lacking under my predecessor. It wasn't enough to be the boss. I needed to be a leader, and a leader doesn't succeed alone. I started holding regular meetings where everyone's voice was heard. I made sure that every team member had a chance to contribute ideas and strategies. What I quickly discovered was that the team had a lot of untapped potential. There were brilliant minds in that room, people who had been waiting for someone to give them the opportunity to shine. As time went on, the team began to gel. We celebrated wins together, even the small ones. And when things didn't go as planned, I was there to pick up the pieces, not to assign blame, but to find solutions. I showed them that failure wasn't the end. It was simply an opportunity to learn and improve. My leadership began to bring results. Projects that had been stalled for months started moving again. The company saw immediate improvements in efficiency and output. The higher-ups took notice. They began sending me more challenging projects, ones that were critical to the company's future. It was a validation of everything I had worked for. But with success came new challenges, the kind I hadn't anticipated. As I gained power and respect, I also made enemies. The people who had once been loyal to my boss now saw me as a threat. They resented the changes I was making, and the fact that I was no longer just the quiet worker bee in the background. They had to answer to me now. At first, I brushed it off. I had bigger things to focus on. But soon, I started noticing the whispers behind my back, the passive-aggressive comments. I wasn't naive, I knew this came with the territory, but it still stung. Some of these people were people I had once considered allies. One afternoon, after a meeting with the executives, I walked into my office to find an anonymous letter on my desk. It was a scathing critique of my leadership style, claiming I was too harsh, too demanding, and not team-oriented. I was taken aback at first. The letter was pointed, personal, and laced with bitterness. It was clear someone had been waiting for the right moment to strike. But instead of letting it shake me, I took a deep breath. I had been down this road before. This was just another obstacle I needed to overcome. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I took action. I called a meeting with the team and addressed the issue head-on. I didn't hide from the criticism. I acknowledged that not everyone would agree with my approach, but I was clear that the direction I was taking was non-negotiable. The meeting wasn't easy. There was tension in the room, and some people were uncomfortable with the changes I was making. But by the end, the team knew where I stood. I wasn't going to back down. I was here to lead, not to be liked. Over the next few months, things started to settle. The resistance began to fade as the team realized that my vision was working. The department was running more efficiently, and our projects were meeting deadlines with a level of excellence that hadn't been seen in years. The higher-ups were impressed. I had earned their trust. But what surprised me most wasn't the recognition, it was the change in me. The person I had been when I first entered the department, the quiet, uncertain worker who had been pushed to the edge, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned the true meaning of leadership, that it wasn't about authority, but about influence. It wasn't about taking control, it was about inspiring others to rise with you. I had turned my boss's mistakes into my greatest victory, and as I stood in front of my team, watching them thrive, I realized that this was more than just a career success. This was a testament to my strength, my resilience, and my ability to turn any setback into a stepping stone towards something greater. Months had passed since I took the reins of the department, and I had learned more in this short time than I ever could have imagined. The changes I'd made had shaken things up, but they'd also opened doors to new possibilities. The department was running smoother, the team was more engaged, and the company was seeing results. But the truth was, none of that mattered as much as the transformation that had happened within me. I had gone from a person who walked into that office every day feeling small, ignored, and constantly second-guessed to someone who now walked with confidence, authority, and a clear vision. I had taken the weaknesses of my predecessor and turned them into stepping stones for my own success. But beyond the titles, the accolades, and the power, what mattered most was what I had learned about myself in the process. When I first started this journey, I wanted nothing more than to escape the toxic environment my boss had created. I had been humiliated, belittled, and ignored for far too long. I had felt like I was drowning, struggling to be seen, to prove myself. But now, I realized something profound. All of that struggle, All of that pain had been the fire that forged me into who I was today. The truth is, the humiliation I faced was never about me. It was never about my ability or worth. It was about him, boss, who was too insecure to see potential in others, too afraid to allow someone else to rise. And in his attempts to hold me down, he had unknowingly created the perfect storm that would push me to become the leader I had always been capable of being. Looking back, I didn't feel anger toward him anymore. At least, not the kind I used to. I felt gratitude, because he had unknowingly played a crucial role in my transformation. His mistakes had been my greatest opportunity, his arrogance, my motivation. And in the end, I had used his failures to craft a future I could be proud of. One afternoon, a few months into my new role, I sat down with the executive team. The department had exceeded expectations, and our progress had earned the attention of higher-ups in the company. It was surreal, sitting there with the people who had once overlooked me, now listening intently as I presented strategies to take the department to the next level. I realized that this moment wasn't about the victory itself, it was about what came next. I had reached the top, but I wasn't satisfied with simply being in control. I wanted more. I wanted to lead not just a successful department, but a movement that would ripple throughout the company, one that would inspire others to rise, to reach beyond their comfort zones, to challenge the status quo. And I knew that if I was going to create lasting change, I had to keep pushing, keep innovating, keep setting the bar higher. As the team and I celebrated another successful quarter, I knew that we had achieved something remarkable, but I was also thinking about what lay ahead. Complacency was a danger, and I refused to fall into the trap of becoming comfortable with what we had accomplished. This was just the beginning. I had always been the type of person who second-guessed myself. I had spent so much of my career doubting my worth, questioning my decisions, and worrying about what others thought of me. But in the months since taking over the department, I had learned to trust myself. I had learned to make decisions quickly, decisively, and without hesitation. Every decision I made, big or small, was a reflection of the leader I had become. But despite this newfound confidence, there were still moments of doubt. I still found myself wondering if I was truly prepared for the challenges ahead, wondering if I had what it took to maintain the success we had worked so hard to achieve. The pressure of leadership was real. It wasn't just about managing the present, it was about shaping the future, and that responsibility could feel overwhelming at times. One morning I was sitting in my office, looking out over the city from my new corner desk, when I had a realization. I didn't have to have all the answers. Leadership wasn't about knowing everything, it was about being willing to learn, to adapt, and to bring out the best in the people around me. It was about creating a culture of trust, one where everyone could contribute, where everyone felt valued. The more I reflected on my journey, the more I realized how important it was to leave a legacy that wasn't just tied to numbers or results, but one that was based on the impact I could have on others. I wasn't just looking to be the best boss or the most successful leader in the company. I wanted to be remembered as the person who changed the game for those who came after me. I made it my mission to mentor others in the department, to give them the guidance and support I had never received. I started focusing not just on the performance of the department, but on the personal growth of the people who worked with me. I took time to listen to their ideas, help them set goals, and provide them with the resources they needed to succeed. I wasn't in this alone, and I didn't want them to feel alone either. The more I invested in them, the more they started to believe in themselves. The culture I was building wasn't about me being the center of attention, it was about creating a collective success, where everyone had a hand in shaping the future. As time went on, I came to realize that the battle for the position wasn't really about the job itself. It was never about taking down my boss, or about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving something to myself, that I was capable of more than I had ever imagined. It was about breaking free from the constraints I had allowed others to impose on me and showing the world that I could lead, not just follow. The company was flourishing, and my team was thriving. My past had shaped me into someone who was not just a survivor of adversity, but a creator of opportunity. I had used the humiliation and missteps of others as the fuel that pushed me forward. But more importantly, I had learned to create my own path. I had become a leader who inspired, empowered, and elevated others, rather than tearing them down. I had taken my boss's mistakes and turned them into my greatest victory. And now, as I stood at the top, I knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter I would write for myself and for those who came after me.